You're about to discover why certain foods are highly addictive and contributing to our epidemics of health issues. You're about to hear from 4 incredible experts in food science, food psychology, genetics, and more to help us understand how these foods are hijacking our biology and how to take back control of our health. And let's kick things off with double board certified medical doctor and nutrition expert, Amy Shaw.
So I was a nutrition major undergrad before I went to medical school. And there's a lab that has electrodes. And they sit and they look at people eating foods. And they're engineering foods that create brain electrical impulses that light up all different parts of our brain, especially the dopamine centers, because the dopamine is the craving pathway, and we can get into that in a little bit. But they're able to make foods that are so good at lighting up all these pathways. No natural food could ever match that. And so if we think about that, it seems innocent, right? Oh yeah, they're just trying to make foods that are more palatable. They want to make more money. But when I realize 80% more mental health days with the people who eat these foods, I mean, more depression, more anxiety, more feeling down when you're eating more of these foods. I mean, shouldn't we look at what we're doing here?
Now, what's really remarkable about this bliss point phenomenon is the fact that, like you just said, it's these kind of intense flavors and combinations that incite these reward pathways. But our biology is also very intelligent, but they found a way to hijack that, because our biology, with anything intense like that, it's going to shut down desire and craving to eat more. So they found this specific point where it takes you there, like right to the depth.
Yeah.
But you don't go past it. And so you just keep staying in that kind of bliss point zone and eat more and more and more.
So our biology is so smart. They want us to pursue things over and over and over again. They want us to work hard to build houses, to provide for our community, to have relationships. All these things are through our reward pathway. So, for example, when you forage for food, thousands of years ago, you find a beautiful tree full of fruit. You get a reward, a dopamine reward. But there's a little bit of discomfort at the end. It's like you're rewarded, but then you have this feeling you got to do it again. And it's so smart. It keeps us going. The next day, you're going to forage for more food, for better food, and it's how we keep evolving, how we keep going and providing for our families. And it's super smart, right? But then you take it to modern times and there's a, Oreo, or let's take, any kind of processed version. And it is creating that kind of dopamine release. And now we're craving more. Now we want more of that. And that's gambling. That's porn. That's alcohol. That's Instagram. That's video games. They all have figured out this pathway that we have never been told about. Before I read the research on how these pathways intricately, like how they're really working, I thought, why doesn't everyone know this? So that we can be better advocates for ourselves, so we can save ourselves from these addictions, from these terrible cravings. If we really understood how it worked, then we'd say, oh, that's what's happening. Right. That's why when I crave something so bad, it's like I get it and then I feel really good, but then it's kind of uncomfortable. Like that's the dopamine pathway working.
Yeah, I love this, because a big part of what we do is shining a light inward, so we actually know what's happening with our minds and bodies. Is very empowering. It's obviously the first step is awareness. And you mentioned Oreos just now. You talk about Oreos in the book, a specific study of mice given the opportunity to have Oreos or cocaine.
Yeah.
And they were going for the cookies.
Yeah, it was very sensationalized in the media. I don't know if you remember when it was such, people were like, Oreos are more addictive than cocaine. And I think what people didn't understand, and they still don't understand, is that there are opiate receptors in our brain that get activated with food. That what I didn't know before I got into this research is that there are gut bacteria that can produce this opiate-like substances to help you eat certain foods They steer you towards certain foods. They make you eat more of what they love. So they can help you in this process of kind of saving yourself from these addictions. So if we knew that, we would do a better job of saving that gut bacteria because they're actually creating opiate-like receptors. They're creating dopamine that is 10 to 100 times stronger than our own dopamine. Serotonin, GABA. I mean, these guys are literally producing happiness chemicals for our brain. They're telling our brain what to eat, what not to eat. So the way you're feeling right now, the things you want, your mental state right now is actually coming from there, not from here.
Yeah. And I think we're looking at this, the average person is looking at this through the lens of logic. And they're like, well, cocaine versus cookies. Like nobody, these little mice aren't trying to do sexual favors to get some Oreos, They're not out here selling their bodies to get Oreos.
Right.
Humans wouldn't do the same thing. But culturally, if we're talking about cocaine versus Oreos are massively socially acceptable.
Right.
Very easily accessible as well.
Yeah.
So acceptable, accessible, and, it's, if we're talking about stigma as well around, something like cocaine, and all of these things start to create this mental template about what we would go for,
right?
And, we're kind of leaning into a subject of like food addiction, which isn't necessarily, the topic we're trying to deconstruct. But if we're in a state where we're eating, like, as you mentioned, 75% ultra processed foods, if we're talking about children, and adults are somewhere in that ballpark, 60 to 75% as well. Are we not addicted?
Yeah, we are. It's like functioning alcoholics, right? So the way I think about food these days is how cigarettes used to be, right? We kind of knew they were a little bit bad for us, but it was socially accepted, and everywhere you go, people were smoking. It was the socially accepted addiction. And I think what's happening right now is we're realizing, whoa, the body of evidence is telling us that ultra processed foods are going to kill us earlier. I mean, there's proof that it shortens your length of life. It's going to give you diabetes, cancer, heart disease. And I don't mean to say it's equal to cigarettes, but it's the same concept. Like, we need to move to a place where there's labels on foods and urge companies to say, well, if you're going to use ultra processed ingredients and you're going to make this, there's going to be a big label and a warning sign so that families, when they're at the supermarket, they see a big sign that says, don't choose that one.
Yeah. And these foods contain obesogens.
Yes. And so then they'll say, oh, well, maybe we should make that version without the ultra processed ingredients. And what I teach in the book is that it's not about just avoiding the ultra processed foods, it's also repopulating your gut bacteria with foods that will give you the right signals of happiness, of when you're full, of, when you should stop eating, when you should be motivated. All of that can happen with just switching out the ultra processed with a real food. The same reasons that we're getting hungrier is the same reasons we're getting sadder, and we're getting fatter, and we're getting sicker. And they're all connected, because I think what we're doing is we're missing this big picture, and we're concentrating on these individual factors. We're saying like, oh, how do we create a pill or a solution for obesity? How do we create a pill solution for, depression? But what about looking at it as the big picture? And I say big because it's brain, immune system, gut, like big picture. If we looked at it through that lens, we would understand that food creates mood, food creates cravings, food creates inflammation, and we could start to change how we kind of view these disorders. It's almost linked as one.
Yeah. Wow. Again, we don't usually think about that. We just get hungry, we go eat some stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's so much deeper than that. And actually, in your book, you shared a study, and this was cited in the journal Cell Metabolism, demonstrating how, for example, ultra-processed foods trigger us to crave them more and to specifically overeat.
This is a landmark study. I mean, we always think that we should go with our intuition. We should just eat what we're craving or hungry for, right? That's the new anti-diet trend. But if you think about it, in this study, what they said is No, if you eat what you want and you're eating a standard American ultra processed diet, you will eat 500 calories more than the unprocessed group, and you will gain 2 pounds in 2 weeks with nothing else different except that you're eating ultra processed food. They found that there's this hormone called neuropeptide YY. It makes you feel satiated and full. And in the ultra processed food group, that hormone was lower. And ghrelin, our hunger hormone, was higher. So even though you're eating food that's matched in calories, matched in fat, in protein, in fiber, and in sugar, you are hungrier and you're less satisfied.
That's bananas. Again, so they were essentially given the same array of caloric options, same ratios of macronutrients, but they were consistently eating about 500 more calories a day when they put them on the ultra processed food diet versus the whole foods diet.
Yeah, imagine this is the perfect study. So diet studies are so hard to do. They brought people in to the NIH and they actually had them stay there so they could monitor all their food for a 2-week period. And they basically had them do both ways. So they had them do an ultra processed 2 weeks and then a regular unprocessed 2 weeks to even say, hey, is there something different about the people themselves? And in 2 weeks, I mean, that's very little time. 2 weeks of monitoring 2 different groups of people, they saw that the ultra processed group was eating more consistently per day, per meal. They were asking for more snacks. They were less full. And shockingly to me, Shawn, the blood sugar and the insulin and all the things that we would think would be really different weren't. And I thought that was shocking because it's basically saying that the gut bacteria, these, the neuropeptide YY, the ghrelin, that's driving the difference between these 2 groups. So when they looked at the conclusions, they said, okay, what is the difference between the ultra processed food and the real unprocessed food? Because the sugar level stayed the same, the insulin, they checked all these other parameters, but it was the gut hormones that changed. And that to me is just more, it just puts so much more weight on the fact that our gut bacteria are running the show when it comes to hunger and cravings.
You put more weight.
Yes.
I heard that. I like that. I like that. So, you talk about in the book, hunger hijackers.
Yeah.
So let's talk about some of those.
I mean, we are a very different world than we were even 70 years ago, right? You can blame it on, internet. You can blame it on Uber Eats if you want, or, DoorDash. You can blame it on packaging of foods. You can blame it, but a lot has changed over the last 70 years. And what's happening is we're noticing that people have more hunger. People are less satisfied. That people have more cravings. So hunger and cravings are 2 different things, but both of them have gone up. And so we're seeing that you're eating more food, you're undernourished, and you're getting more depressed, but you're getting fatter. It's like obesity is on the rise, but you're undernourished and you're feeling sad. And if you think about it, when you think about it from the gut-brain lens, it makes sense because those gut bacteria, they make dopamine, they make serotonin, they make peptides that make you hungry or full. And so if you start to damage these by, all the things that we're doing, but mostly food, you're going to see a change in how we feel.
Yeah. And you talked about specifically, you called some of them out. You even talked about, for example, emulsifiers.
Yeah.
Causing this disruption.
So if you think about how some of these food products, they increase the shelf life. They make it easy for us to, ship something from California to Florida. You can't ship real food from California to Florida without it spoiling, right? So you have to put things in it that increase the shelf stability. You have to put things in it so it doesn't separate. So emulsifiers, if you don't put emulsifiers in food, it will separate.
Like a salad dressing.
Yeah.
For
It will
example.
when you look at a natural salad dressing, it'll separate the water and the oil, right? Or for example, I have, I make this chai tea just for with coconut milk. And what happens is people will say, hey, it doesn't mix that easy in water. You have to
Mhm.
really mix it. And I said, because we don't use emulsifiers. If you use these products, it makes it palatable, makes it easy, makes it convenient. So what's happened is in the search for the tastiest, most shelf stable, most convenient and inexpensive foods, we have created hunger hijackers.
Mm.
And we didn't know. I mean, it depends on if you believe in the conspiracy theory or not. And I'm not going to say that I fully believe in that because I am on the medical side of things. And I don't think that there's doctors who are getting together and willingly wanting to keep people sick. And so I don't think the food manufacturers per se are trying to keep us hungry, but they're keeping us hungry because that helps their bottom line. It is helpful to have foods that are tasty because you come back for more. When it creates a dopamine explosion in your brain, you're going to come back for more.
Mm-hmm.
A real food is like a dopamine spray, a water gun spray. An ultra-processed food is a dopamine explosion. And so what we end up doing is we're teaching our kids that, hey, you can get a dopamine explosion from these, and they unknowingly start to have more of them. And now 75% of adolescents eat ultra-processed food as part of their main diet. So you look at a child adolescent's diet, and only 25% is real food. Everything else is ultra-processed.
It's insane.
It's insane. But if you think about it, you can't blame these guys, right? Why wouldn't you want a dopamine explosion? Who wants to eat a salad and maybe get a spray of
Flimsy
dopamine?
little,
Yeah. It's like nothing. Going for a sunny walk, that's nothing compared to, drinking alcohol or eating one of these ultra processed snacks. So that's what we're up against.
We're so dumb, we think it's easy, and we think our problem is we've underestimated food. We said, oh, it's easy. Food, it's about calories. It's about saturated fat. It's about the sugars. That's all you need to do. Or sort this out. All you got to do is cut out lectins, cut out gluten, do this. Reductionism, we're so clever. It's all about this vitamin. Just take vitamin D, you'll be fine. Vitamin C, injections, all sorted. It's nonsense. Humans are incredibly complicated. Food has over 30,000 chemicals in it. Our gut microbes convert that food into hundreds of thousands of different molecules we still know very little about. And all of us produce different ones, and they go into our blood in different ways. So we're much more complex machines than we've given ourselves credit for. And the idea, we can divide our food into three sort of sections, and that's it. Are you high fat, high carb? It's just rubbish. We've got to start thinking much more holistically and realize that, yes, we need to, even with the Zoe program, where we look at fats and sugars and microbiome, they're just the things we can measure at the moment. It's pretty good, but there might be other stuff in 10, 20 years' time. There's some other technology that shows us, there's other bits in that picture as well. But at least we're moving in that right direction towards understanding this human complexity that is, it's sort of fun because it also, I think, always keeps coming back to the same thing, that to be, the best bet is to eat a diverse diet. It's to have as many different plants as you can. It's to have these fermented foods with all kinds of different bugs in them, these probiotics. It's to sort of throw everything at you, increase your sense of smell and taste, and try everything. It's that variety. Variety is the spice of life. And I think that's what we keep coming back to as the way to deal with our complexity.
So with that being said, this information coming from our gut, informing us on what foods to eat to feed them, let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So if you think each of your microbes has its own evolution, and like we've evolved, but it takes multiple generations for us to change our genes and evolve, whereas some of our gut microbes can reproduce every 30 minutes. Okay, so they're living hard and fast and furious, these guys, right? They're, having sex and having babies, and it's all happening, inside an hour. And so their genes are changing. And if you get an overgrowth of, say, particular bugs that like living in an inflammatory environment. Okay, so they like, burgers and fries and things that will generate lots of fats and things that will generate a little bit of inflammation, which is sort of the stress molecules you get in your gut. Then they will evolve to send out chemical signals to get more of it if they can. And that's what we know happens in some animal models, that by growing certain microbes, they'll send off chemicals to say, send me more of that food. And they've done all kinds of really fancy experiments to change the way insect behavior works, so that rather than picking sugars, they'll go for protein, or vice versa, just by switching around their microbes. So they've proven that your microbes can certainly determine your choice of foods, how much sweet, how much protein. And we think the same happens to some extent in humans. Haven't been able to prove it, but it makes absolute sense. And it probably is why people get into this junk food cycle, where the only microbes that are still living, because these are just living off a bit of fat that's down there, and other chemicals that they're living off in a very inflamed environment. Their natural evolution, if they've been there for years or so, they've probably evolved chemicals to say, give me more of this food, because of this symbiotic relationship with the host. Because they're just sitting there waiting for you to eat another burger, and they might well send signals saying, well, I don't want any of that salad, I don't want that gherkin. Just give me more of the, I want more of that bread and more of that that burger. So that's what we think happens. We haven't proven it, but it's certainly in the insect world, where you can do these experiments by swapping foods around. It's very clear it works, and it sort of makes sense, because the microbe, like us, is evolving, but they're just doing it so much faster. And so I think it's one of the reasons that it is hard for people to break these habits, and to go from very unhealthy diets to healthy diets. Sometimes if you've got the wrong set of microbes, they're not going to be happy for the first few weeks. And it's also why people with some gut problems do find it hard to suddenly shift to a high fiber diet early on. They're not geared up for it, so they have to be, and they often get put off because they feel unwell when they first start. So I think it's all part of this idea that having lost all the healthy microbes, you don't have those guys there breaking down the foods as you'd like them as well.
Food has always been at a premium. Food has always been scarce. It's always been hard to find for the vast majority of time. And if you had the opportunity to eat it, that would give you a survival advantage. So we're unique in that we store a lot of fat, and this is so we could travel long distances, so we could explore. It allowed us to survive. So if you think about it in the past, if you had let's say every seventh day, you couldn't really find that much food. This meant that if you had the opportunity to overeat, you should do it, because you're going to not have food at some point. We still have that ancient wiring in a time where we have 7-Elevens on the corner. We got grocery stores. We got Burger King. We got food everywhere, right? The average, I think we throw out about a third of the food we produce in America. And so when I like to say that, getting in trouble with food, let's say if you're at a weight that you don't want to be at because you've eaten too much, I like to say that it's not necessarily your fault, because you're kind of doing this thing that humans evolved to do. But it is your problem to solve if you would like to reduce your weight, right? It's still going to take action. you can't, it's kind of a thing you gotta figure out for yourself.
Now, add to this the fact that we do have these ultra processed food manufacturers who are taking advantage even more of our biology, right? And it gets into that scarcity loop of the ability to repeat a behavior very easily. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the I bet you can't eat just one
Right,
phenomenon.
totally. So, so I explained the scarcity loop. Now, as I'm reporting the book, I come across this quote from a person who is a CEO or an exec at a snack food company. So snacking wasn't really a thing until about 1970. And what happened is that the food industry goes, all right, well, people are eating 3 meals. They're probably not going to eat a ton more in each meal. But what we can do is we can create a new category of food and give them new opportunities to eat. So the food industry goes, we're going to create this new category called snacking. Now, if people have eaten, you got to be like, all right, well, what will people eat after they've already eaten? Right? So this guy explains, if you want a snack food to take off, it has to have 3 V's. It's got to have value. It's got to have variety. It's got to have velocity. So what does that sound like? Sounds like the scarcity loop that I just explained, right? So it's got to be relatively cheap, high calorie. It's got to have variety, meaning there is a lot of flavor per bite, meaning there's a lot of different options. So you mentioned Pringles before we started recording. How many different Pringles are there? There's like 25 different Pringles. There's like sour cream and onion. There's barbecue. There's spicy barbecue. There's like, just keep going, right? And it's got to have velocity, meaning that it has to be easy to eat, meaning you can consume it faster.
Yeah.
Now, I think that velocity is the number one thing when it comes to food. So when food companies process a food, turn a food into an ultra processed food, basically repeated steps of processing that are done to increase flavors, increase all these things that make food delicious, people will tend to eat the food a lot faster. So there's a really great NIH study from Kevin Hall, who I'm sure his name has come up on this podcast before. He's done a really great piece of research where he took a group of people and for 2 weeks, he locks them in a lab, right? So for 2 weeks, he lets them, he gives them only food that is very minimally processed. Says, eat as much as you want. And they're weighing every single thing these people eat. Like it's extremely nitty gritty with the tracking. Then after that, for the next 2 weeks, he gives them a diet that is equivalent in macros and salt and things like that, except the food is ultra processed. It's sort of the ultra processed take on that. He says, all right, eat as much as you want. Again, they're tracking every single thing. And what he finds is that when people are on the ultra processed diet, they end up eating about 500 calories more per day, and they end up gaining weight. And the reason mainly comes down to the speed at which they ate the food. So when a food is ultra processed, it's super easy to eat. Think about getting a piece of, I have a guy who's quoted in the book. His name's Mike Roussel. He's a nutritionist. And he's like, yeah, my son ordered a pizza from Pizza Hut the other day. He's like, I had a slice. It's like, it literally just like melts in your mouth and falls down the back of your throat, right? Think about eating something like broccoli. Like it takes so long to eat. It's like crunchy. It's kind of a pain in the ass to eat broccoli. A better comparison might be, think of eating potato chips versus a boiled potato, right? You're never going to sit down and eat 1,000 calories in boiled potatoes. But people will sit down and eat 1,000 calories in potato chips all the time because it got all these triggers that make you want to eat it. Also very quick to eat.
Yeah. Wow. And of course, they're manufactured to be that way. It's taking advantage of this hard wiring. One of those phenomenons is the vanishing caloric density. So it's like that melt in the mouth experience. So it kind of, in a way, because when you eat foods through our evolution, there's a certain feedback when you're biting into that food. We were just talking about this as well with gastrophysics and like a certain crunch, a certain experience. And through our evolution, this would be tied to a certain nutrient density as well. But now with the food, you get this crunch, but then it disappears. So there's like the feedback loop is interrupted. It's just like, did I just eat as much as I thought? Okay, next one. It's just like, it's not, it's tricking our brains in a sense, and our biology, not just our brains, because our brains are really, even though we can kind of hack it, it's very, very complicated. Like, it's been called the most complicated object in the known universe by Michio Kaku, who's like, we just talked about gastrophysics, but astrophysics and like modern day Einstein. And our brains are very, very complicated, but there are certain things, certain buttons we can push. And you highlight this so well in the book that you can get in there and really manipulate what's happening. Now, with that being said, the fact that we evolved in conditions where there was a lack, there's scarcity. Now that we have all of this abundance, that programming doesn't suddenly turn off. We're designed for a very different reality than the one that we find ourselves in. And so a lot of people are beating themselves up because it's difficult to adjust in this environment. And what we're doing is really putting power into people's hands by us. Like, I think awareness can really help even what's happening with our brains when we can see the thing happening before it happens or while it's happening. Like, oh, this is that thing happening. This is that scarcity brain of mine that's doing this thing. Obviously, you're kind of getting us a peek behind the scenes of a lot of what's happening. But what are some of the things that we can do about this to kind of take back control of what's happening internally?
Yeah. I'll give you examples using food. So with any behavior that falls in this scarcity loop, I think the first thing is, to your point, becoming aware of it. Once you know how the machine works, then you have a better probability of choosing not to mess with the machine if you don't want to, right? But just knowing how it works. I have a good friend, Trevor Cashy, who works in the field of nutrition and other fields. He said, the dessert really tastes delicious until you realize the chef put monkey brains in it. And then it's not so delicious, is it? Mm-hmm. So the second way is that you can change or remove any of the three parts of the loop, and that will tend to reduce the behavior. So we'll use food as an example. You can take away or change the opportunity. So if you've got some food that once you have one, I think you alluded to that, once you pop, you can't stop or whatever, don't keep it in the house. Like that's pretty simple. That removes that opportunity that you're going to go, yeah, I'm on this great bender with my health. Things are great, blah, blah, blah. But then you get stressed out or you get a shitty email from your boss and you go, yeah, I'm just going to have one Pringle. And then all of a sudden the 10 of them is gone. Number two, you can take away the unpredictable rewards. A lot of that comes down to, does everything that we eat have to taste like a party in our mouth? Right? No. So as part of this book, for example, I can get into why, but I'll be quick here, is that I travel into Bolivia to hang out with this tribe called the Chamane tribe. And they have the healthiest hearts ever recorded by science. And it goes back to what they eat, basically. Their diet is they don't eat processed food. They eat food that has a single ingredient. Now, I spend a week with them. I eat what they eat, and I'm going to tell you, their food was not delicious. It was very boring. There's not a lot of salt. There's not a lot of flavor. And when something doesn't taste amazing in every single bite, like, your likelihood of taking another bite diminishes. At the same time, if you're truly hungry, a food that doesn't have a ton of flavor will still be satisfying and still be good. Mm-hmm. So I think realizing that, like, not everything you eat needs to taste amazing. Like, that seems relatively reasonable, right? And then third, quick repeatability. Eating foods that are less processed slows down the process of eating and leads you to take in fewer calories.
Makes sense. Very simple.
Yeah, it's simple. It's like, eat foods that are mostly unprocessed that humans have been eating for thousands and thousands of years. And people will look at that and go, yeah, well, I already know that. But, well, okay, well, now you know why it works. Yeah. Right. And it absolutely does work. I mean, that's the foundation of human health to me.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of just even shifting the ratio. You mentioned that NIH study, and being a diet that's just completely ultra processed foods, you're inherently going to eat more. Calories the same, macronutrients the same. Mm-hmm. That was so fascinating. And also in that study, what happened was, just subconsciously, folks ended up eating less protein in those ultra processed meals. They were just like weeding it out and getting to more carbohydrate dominant things, which stimulates more appetite. It's just like our biology is cleverly finding a way for you to eat more of that stuff.
Yeah.
And so just shifting the ratio, you don't have to go completely. If you're right now, the average American adult, according to the BMJ, 60% of our diet as an adult is ultra processed foods. What if we, instead of the 60-40, the way that the house is winning, I guess, go 60-40 whole foods? That is going to probably have some tremendous benefits for your health.
And I think that once you start that and you get good feedback from doing that, I think it increases the probability that you'll continue with the behavior, maybe even shift the ratio to even better. And I think you're spot on that, I'm not saying that people should only eat foods with one ingredient for the rest of their life. I don't want to live in a world where I don't have the option to occasionally have some Pringles. It's a delicious food. The problem is when that is 60% of your diet, you start to see a lot of the problems that we face today. To me, like the scale weight thing is irrelevant, but really the problem with being obese is that increases the likelihood that you will have certain chronic diseases, right? So people will say, just because you're obese doesn't mean you're going to be unhealthy. Well, of course not. But what it does mean is that it loads the dice in favor of disease. So it's like, do you want to roll the loaded dice or do you not want to roll the loaded dice?
Can you talk about the Miami study?
Yes. So this one was really fascinating about how scarcity cues affect us. So a scarcity cue is a piece of information that we encounter in the environment that suggests that things that we need to survive are scarce, or all is not right with the world, basically. So what these scientists did is they had this table where they had a bowl of low-calorie M&Ms and high-calorie M&Ms. And they would let, students choose whichever they wanted. And when students received a scarcity cue, which was like news of a war that could put, a ration on food or something like that, people chose the high calorie M&Ms and they ate twice as many of them compared to if they didn't receive that scarcity cue. So the sort of conclusion from the researchers was that, when we think the things we need are going to be scarce, we tend to react by eating food. And that makes sense from a historical perspective. It's like if you think that all of a sudden there's going to be a run on food, well, we've got built-in refrigerators on our frame in the form of fat. It's like just start eating food. And you see that among all animals too.
I'm going to guess that you don't have a Doritos or a Cheetos tree in your backyard, right? Because there's no such thing. And I love my favorite peer-reviewed journal, The Onion. Right? They had a headline that says Doritos celebrates its 1 millionth ingredient, right? Because they are dialing it in every day, right? And there's a reason that those both are like electric orange. And the Cheetos is a great example of vanishing caloric density, where it's like, well, did you just eat something? No, better try it again.
Yep.
Try it again. So those are designed for addiction. Michael Moss wrote brilliantly about this, where, all these things that they engineer, from feeling like we're in control with Lunchables, like kids feeling like they're in control of what they're eating, to all of these, bliss point manipulations to get people just addicted to things. The funny thing there is addiction is not pleasant. And so when we're just mindlessly consuming or feeling like we are under the spell of whatever the chip or the ultra processed food is, that's not actually very pleasant when you pay attention, because you feel like there's this drive that you have no control over, right? Addiction is continued use despite adverse consequences. That's what I learned in residency. Continued use despite adverse consequences. Well, if you look at food and somebody eating an entire bag, continued use despite adverse consequences when they feel like they can't stop, right? So they're designed for addiction. If we pay attention, we can start to see pretty clearly that they're actually not very rewarding. And so we hit that second step where we become disenchanted when we see, oh, addiction doesn't feel very good. None of my patients with addiction say, this is great. Help me be more addicted, doc. They come to me for the opposite. So the third step, I think of this as finding the BBO, the bigger, better offer.
Not to be mistaken with the BBO.
Yes, not to be mistaken with the BBO. So the BBO, this actually came from my high school days. It's like you set up a date and you're all looking forward to it on Friday, and then suddenly your date's like, oh, I'm washing my hair or whatever, lame excuse. It's like, oh, they found somebody else asked them out, and they're bigger, better offer than I am. So like, I'm relegated to watching television while they go out with the other person. So the bigger, better offer, our brain is set up this way where it's going to have preferences. It's going to say A or B. If B is better, I'm picking B, right? So if we can start to see that our old habits are not that great, that's what that second step is about, becoming disenchanted, we can then give our brain something better. And the nice thing about better is that it's already there. It might simply be paying attention as we eat and stopping before we're overstuffed. Because what feels better, stopping before you're overstuffed or being overstuffed? Duh, right? It's a no-brainer to our brain. So bringing that awareness in, again, awareness is critical for this third step as well. Just seeing like, oh, how much is enough? How much is enough? That in itself can be more rewarding, that bigger, better offer. Another way to help actually with all of these steps, I think of this curiosity as this bigger, better offer because it feels better. It feels better than the craving. So if we have a craving for something, and we're doing, let's say I think of it as rest and digest. Like if we're going like 14 hours between eating dinner and breakfast or something like that, like the time restricted eating. At first, when somebody's starting to get used to that, they can have craving. If they snack a lot at night, they might have a craving for a snack, even though they're not hungry. And so getting curious about that craving helps them work with and ride that craving out, instead of trying to fight with it or like try to distract themselves or whatever. So they can disarm that craving. They can see that craving doesn't have any power if you bring in that the curiosity, because you get curious about it and suddenly, oh, it's just these sensations. It's not that big of a deal. And so curiosity itself is tremendously powerful. If you can't see what it is, if you can't map it, you can't work with it. So habits, you've got to bring them into the light. And so we bring these habits into the light through awareness, through curiosity. Like, oh, what's this habit? So for example, we can start with our eating behavior. And first off, I want to give a shout out to the stories that I talk about in my book. So my patients and the people in our Eat Right Now program were just so generous with sharing their stories with me that I could share those stories with other people to help them so they could see like, this is what it's like in real life. And their stories ranged from like stress eating to just mindless eating to overeating to binge eating, and to being addicted to fast food. One of the people in the book like really talked about how that was his drug. And so I just want to give a shout out to them for being so kind and generous with their stories. And with that, I highlight in the book how the first step for any of us is to map out what the habit loop around eating is, because there can be multiple ones. There can be one that's dominant. There can be ones that show up at certain times of day or under certain circumstances, but they all share the same structure, that trigger, the behavior, and the result. And the nice thing here is the trigger's not important. People might think, what? Trigger? Because most of my patients come in, they're like, well, if I could just avoid or tackle or fight with my triggers, then I could win. Well, triggers only set the process going. They're not what drive the process. So I say, forget about the triggers, right? If you can recognize them, if you can name them, great, but don't worry about it. Focus on the behavior. So is it mindless eating? Is it overeating? Is it stress eating? Is it boredom eating? Is it sad eating? Is it happy eating? You get the idea.
It's a lot of kind of eating.
Yeah. Well, all of these things get associated with eating, but in the absence of actual hunger, right? So these are the hunger habits where we think we're hungry, but we're not actually needing food. I think of the differentiation here is between homeostatic hunger, which is the actual need for food, and hedonic hunger, which is all the emotional eating. Yeah. So they've got to map that piece out. Like, why am I going to food, right? What is driving that? Is it boredom? Is it stress? Is it, sadness, whatever? So seeing what that is and how they're eating. So I think of it as the why, what, and how. Like, why are they reaching for food? What are they reaching for? Is it comfort food? There's a reason it's called comfort food. And then, how am I eating it? Are they just pounding it? Are they just mindlessly eating it? Or are they really paying attention? And all of those are important. But that first step is just mapping out that loop. So trigger, behavior, result. And if they can't notice the trigger, just the behavior and the result. So does that make sense?
Absolutely. That's profound in of itself. Just paying attention to the reason that we're eating.
Mm-hmm.
We usually don't do that,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and this could be, like you said, so many different reasons. You know, especially in the like fitness space, this could be you're eating because you have to, you know, it's a time thing. It's a math equation that you're doing this on. This could be entertainment is a big thing, just like a taste for something or something interesting. You know, this could be, as you mentioned, comfort food. You know, we could be depressed and looking for that little hit of serotonin from some carbs, you know, but we don't think about it. And so it's just happening. Like we're not really paying attention to our reality, our lives. And we're not thinking about our thinking.
Right.
And so even this, like if people get this, this is going to change your life completely. Just being able to pay attention to why you're doing some of the things you're doing.
Yeah.
Be in your body, in your space, in your brain, in your own mind, and paying attention. It's kind of freaky. It's like some Neo stuff when you start to pay attention. Like, well, you know, it's like
red pill, blue pill. Yeah. That awareness is critical. And the beauty of it is that I can, you know, as I'm taking a history with, you know, an intake with one of my patients, like that's what I'm listening for, right? So certainly their story is important, and we can zoom in on, okay, you know, here's some of these habits that I'm hearing. Am I getting this right? So first, I can help them see that I'm actually listening, which is already, you know, helpful, because in medical space is a mess right now.
Yeah.
So it's like, yeah, I really do care, because I do. Like, I love working with my patients. So one, I'm listening and I'm reflecting it back to make sure I'm getting the story right, which is also helpful. And I'm helping them start to make these connections. So, you know, can they see what's the trigger, what's the behavior, what's the result? And then I'm like, hey, can you see that this is a habit loop? And then I explain it very briefly, like we just talked about. You know, it's like, hey, if it's pleasant, you're going to want more of it. If it's unpleasant, you're going to want less of it. That's pretty straightforward. Your brain's set up that way. Yeah. And they say, oh, wow, I never realized that that's where, you know, eating popcorn while I'm watching a movie, and when I don't have the popcorn, I feel like there's something off, because that's just what they're used to, right? Seeing those habits illuminates them so that they can now, you know, see how their mind works. So you got to see how your mind works before you can work with your mind. And that's where steps 2 and 3 come in, is working with your mind.
Part 2 is changing the reward value of these eating behaviors in our brains.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah. So we touched on that a little bit earlier, but this is really where this Rescorla-Wagner equation comes in, and also critically depends on awareness. So basically, if we know this is how our brain works, that our brain's not going to change a habit until it sees that it is actually better than expected or worse than expected, right? So let's start with the worse than expected. I have people pay attention as they overeat, you know, and as I mentioned that study, relatively quickly, people start to realize overeating does not feel good, right? The holidays, when somebody overindulges in a holiday, their stomach says, dude, why did you do that again? Right? They're like, well, I wasn't paying attention. You know, this is the food looks good, or we're in good conversation, or my family's a mess. And so I eat to numb myself, you know, and that numbing is actually not that rewarding. So they pay attention as they overeat, and they start to, their body tells them everything they need to know, which is, hey, overeating, not so great. So they start to become disenchanted with that behavior. And we can distill that down to one question, which is, what am I getting from this, right? Not a thinking, I shouldn't overeat, but a feeling, what does it feel like to overeat? That's critical. It's the feeling body. That's what drives all of behavior change.
Now, moving on, in this part of the equation, I think we miss out on a lot. Let's proactively, intelligently put in place a reward that has to be equal to or better than that other thing.
Yeah.
And that's the part. It's so crazy at this point. I love talking to you about this. It's like, it's so often left out. It's just like, again, use your willpower.
Right.
If it tastes good, spit it out. All these different things. You have to replace that. You have to add in the reward intentionally to get the real sustainable change.
So here's the crazy thing. The reward is already there. And
Right.
so
yeah.
let's frame this a little bit. How many people can think back to the last time they ate their favorite treat, ice cream, cake, chocolate, whatever, and think back to, you've got the ice cream in your mouth and you're already thinking about that next bite or that next lick of ice cream or that next bite of cake. You're not actually enjoying what's in your mouth. So you are wasting food. If it's, like there's food for calories, but like if you're enjoying a really good dessert,
you're missing out on all the pleasure that's
the
there.
whole point is that it's a really good dessert. So don't spit it out. Actually pay attention as you eat it. And I think I write about this in the book. I call it the pleasure plateau. And my friend Dana Small, who's a food scientist at Yale, she actually did this for a PhD thesis where she fed people basically their favorite chocolate while she was measuring their brain activity. And at the beginning, people were like, this is awesome. I love chocolate. And then she would just keep feeding them and feeding them and feeding them. And what she found, and I think the record was 74 squares of chocolate before somebody's like, Uncle, get me out of here. What did I sign up for? But all of them go from, this is amazing, I want more, to this is awful. Eating another piece would make me feel sick. And what that highlights is, I think of this as the pleasure plateau, which is a little bit tastes good if we really pay attention. And with each bite, our body's going to say at some point, okay, that's enough. And if we don't pay attention, we're going to hit that pleasure plateau and we're just going to go right off the cliff of overindulgence. And so if we pay attention with each bite, one, we're enjoying the food. That's what it's for. Mm-hmm. Two, we can see it, we can sense and feel and taste and smell where our body's saying, okay, that's good. That's good. Save the rest for later, right? And we can save the rest for later. If it's really good, why not enjoy it twice as compared to like not paying attention and just like shoveling it down and craving that next bite? So it changes the experience completely because we're, one, really enjoying the food, and two, we're naturally stopping without willpower, without anything except awareness. Our body is so amazing in that way. It's got everything. All we have to do is tap into its strength, its power, its wisdom.
Hey, if you like this video, make sure to check out this video right here.
So the primary causes, which are by my standards, stimuli that are capable of causing insulin resistance on their own, so independent of any other signal, and have also been shown to cause insulin resistance in every biomedical model used in science. And you just mentioned all of them: stress, inflammation, and then insulin itself.